Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to another one of these one-take videos. And on this video, I'm going to talk all about hand planes and setting them up and using them like a pro and being able to handle really difficult grains and kind of what are some of the uses for some hand planes and others. So it's a lot of information. Hopefully I don't forget too much. And we're going to dive right in. I'm going to bring you in close and talk a little bit about some of the principles of how hand planes actually work first. And then that'll help you better understand what I'm going to be doing actually planing. So if you come on in here, we'll talk a little bit about some of the principles here that are really important to making a hand plane work good. And we're really going to be kind of talking about difficult grains, curly woods, figured woods that give people the most trouble. If it's nice, easy grain direction, like if the grain's running away from you, like you're supposed to plane in the direction of the grain, that means the grain is running off, then you'll usually have no problems if you have a sharp blade and stuff isn't off too much. It's when you have to plane into the grain, and that usually happens when there's figured woods or the wood grain changes direction halfway through a board. That's where people usually run into problems and have tear out. So some of the really important principles is having a sharp blade, and then also the depth of cut. Now, certain times in the life of a board, when you're bringing a board from a rough sawn board down to your finished piece, you'll go at it in a different manner. You might start with a scrub plane. Now this is a number 4, which was designed to be a smoother, but it didn't have a lateral adjuster. I got it for super cheap and I just converted it to a scrub plane. A scrub plane has a really wide open mouth. It has a big cambered blade, and the chip breaker is set far away from the blade edge so that you can take really big scoops at once. So you're not really worried about tear out too much when you're going through that scrub process. You're taking a rough board and you're getting it close to its final dimensions. You're working on twist or any kind of warpage. You're taking off high spots at a high rate of speed. And you might move to something like a joining plane or a 4 plane, like your Stanley number 7, your number 8, 7, or 6, to then start taking all those roughing marks out and start flattening that board even better. And at that point, your mouth's still going to be a little bit open. Your chip breaker won't be set too close to the cutting edge. And we're going to talk about why that's super important later on. It's not really important yet. We're still trying to take off quite a bit of material and do the process of flattening. So the depth of cut is going to have a big impact on how much tear out you have. If you're taking big depths of cut, you basically have a stronger shaving because it's thicker and it can act like a wedge and break into the wood almost like an axe splitting a piece of firewood. Does the same thing. In this situation here, we don't have a chip breaker. The grain of the wood is running off and away from us in the direction we want to be planing, so you're not going to have a whole lot of problem here. Then one of the other important principles is cutting angle. Most of your standard old Stanley planes are going to be a 45-degree cutting angle, and nowadays there's a lot of these low angle jack planes. I don't own one. I probably never will because I see a lot of faults with them. I think it makes the plane less versatile because you can't have a chip breaker on it because the blade is flipped upside down. So it would be this side on the top, and you just can't put a chip breaker on there. And chip breakers are the secret, in my opinion, to planing and smoothing and handling really, really gnarly grain. It's all about the chip breaker plus a couple other things. So here's a diagram of what you'll run into if you're planing against the grain and maybe your blade is not super sharp or you're taking too big of a cut. Now, even if you have a really sharp blade and are taking a fine cut, what likely is going to happen is you're going to get tear out. And what happens is this blade is acting like a wedge and the grain's running down and away. And what it's going to want to do is this is maintaining a pretty shallow curve, not a very tight, steep curve, and it holds on to its strength and therefore will start tearing ahead of the blade. Now, there's some really cool little tricks, some really awesome science that helps us prevent that. One of the things, and there's different opinions out there, but what I believe in most is a chip breaker, and a chip breaker that's super close to the cutting edge, much closer than I think most people think it's supposed to be. So what kind of happens on a microscopic level here is that the cutting edge cuts the piece of wood, and the chip or shaving, as soon as it is cut, slams into this chip breaker, and the chip breaker should be at a certain angle, anywhere between 50 and 80 degrees. If it's too steep of a chip breaker, then it really doesn't help. Your chips can still stay basically strong and act like a lever. So what we're doing is we're rolling that chip over, we're breaking that chip, and what kind of happens is the fibers of the wood, they're made up of many fibers, and they're running in this direction. And what kind of happens, as soon as this chip hits that chip breaker and is immediately forced to roll over, you're essentially causing a shear failure, shear strength, which is when you're holding two things together and they slide next to each other. You're breaking that force of those wood fibers and shearing that, and they essentially start sliding next to each other. Almost like if you take this piece of this notebook, if you start bending it over, they're able to slide by each other and bend really easy, and you can just roll it along. Now, if this was a fused together piece of wood, if I tried bending that over, it would start breaking and cracking and everything like that. So it's that same kind of principle at a really microscopic level, and it weakens those fibers and lets you plane even with the grain to a certain extent. And I want to talk about the angle of the blade in which it enters the wood too. So sometimes, some of you may have heard of high angle smoothing planes, and it's kind of the same principle as a card scraper. With a card scraper, you're pretty much attacking the wood at past the 90 degrees, and the hook of your card scraper is hitting the wood at almost a 90-degree angle. And it just, instead of cutting and driving a wedge into the wood, you're just scraping that surface, and you're instantly rolling over that wood and causing it to break. So high angle planes kind of do the same purpose and serve the same function of these chip breakers, is that the wood jams into them right away, and they cause that wood to break and fail and can smooth through really difficult grains. I haven't ever found a piece of wood yet that I haven't been able to use with a regular just 45-degree plane and the chip breaker set right. So like I said, the chip breaker needs to be super close. It needs to be between 50 and 80 degrees, and it needs to be dead flat to the back of your iron, and your iron needs to be really sharp. Those things there will cause you to be able to handle pretty much any wood. Now, there's some trial and error. If you have your chip breaker too close, it might start causing jamming, things like that. If it's too far away, that's when you'll start getting your tear out. So there's kind of some variables that you have to fiddle around with to get it just right, but after some practice, you'll get really good at it, and you'll be able to tackle the nastiest of woods. Another thing that I've seen some people do is they temporarily will put a steeper back bevel on their cutting edge, and you would have your chip breaker basically meet right here, and then now you have essentially created an angle at which this blade is entering the wood. Instead of 45 degrees, it's either 50 or 55 degrees. And then the last piece of the puzzle that really helps is having a tight mouth on your plane. So the tighter you can get your mouth without causing jams, which is what will happen if you get too tight, all of a sudden everything will jam up in there. It's kind of that sweet spot. So the mouth of the plane will press down and compress the front of this wood to prevent that wood from wanting to break up and away. It keeps it pushed down nice and tight until that blade can cut it. So with those principles together, there's pretty much nothing out there that you can't handle. And this is an example of curly wood or some figured wood. You have grain going away from you, which is what you want, and then all of a sudden going back into the wood, and this is where you'll get tear out and that kind of thing. So we're going to go back over here now. Oh, one last thing. I wanted to show that I see a mistake a lot of people make is they have the regular number 45 hand plane, and this is the angle, 45 degrees, and they think that if they skew it, they'll be able to get a nicer cut. Well, this makes it easier to go through the wood, but what you do is you're actually reducing the angle at which that blade is cutting the wood. So you turn a 45-degree angle, a nice steep angle, into something like 40 or even less. And here's an example. So here's a bevel gauge set at 45 degrees. Now watch, when I turn this at an angle and I'm still traveling in that direction, you can see it's much more than 45 degrees now. It kind of doesn't make sense at first. You think that, oh yeah, this is going to make things, now it'll push through the wood easier and it'll slice easier, but it's not going to reduce tear out more. Actually, if you have a smoothing plane set up properly, or those high angle ones, they're actually kind of hard to push through the wood because there's so much force resisting you, but that's how you get that smooth surface. And then here's an example of this. This is a Stanley 10.5, and you can see a really good profile, side profile of the chip breaker, the iron. You can see I have that chip breaker set right down to the edge. And then with your mouth for different tasks, say you're doing rough work, you would have the mouth open, you know, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And then when you're doing smoothing stuff, you have that chip breaker really, really tight and your mouth really, really closed, you know, like a 1/16 or less. And then you just have to play with it to see what works. So let's hop over here and I'll show you some examples. So I have a piece of really, really curly figured maple here, and it has a glass smooth finish on it right now. And I have a smoothing plane here, and I have one of my number 5s that I have set for smoothing. So these, if you can see, hopefully through the light back there, that the mouth is set really, really tight. And the chip breaker on these, and these are aftermarket. Actually, I have this thing set a little bit looser. This is what most people have their plane set at. If you can see that, hopefully you get a reflection of light. There's a little dust there. You can see it's about a 1/16 of an inch or so. That's where most people have their planes. And this is really good for general use, but this is probably gonna not work for smoothing nasty woods. And I also ground the front edge of my chip breaker. I made sure the bottom of it was dead flat. I made sure the face of my plane blade was polished. And then I put a about 70-degree small little bevel on the front edge of that. So as soon as my chip is cut by that blade, it's hitting that 70-degree chip breaker and instantly rolling over and breaking. Now I have a couple videos. I have a video on restoring a hand plane. I talk about a lot of this stuff. And I have a video on sharpening a hand plane or plane blades and other blades. And I show you a couple different methods. So check those out. I'll put links down in the description and some cards up at the top here. So what I would want this at for smoothing is I want this blade just, I mean, less than a fine pencil width. Almost like, you know, about as thin as a hair on your head. And most people don't get that. So it's just the tiniest of slivers that's poking through there. And actually right now, if you can see it, that's even a little bit heavy of a cut if you want to tackle some nasty grain. I know I got this guy set up really well, so I'll just show you an example of this gnarly. If you can feel this right now, and hopefully we can capture it in the light, it's just glass smooth right now. That's the beautiful thing about a smoothing plane, is that it actually, or any kind of plane that's got a good edge on it, the surface, you can't get this with sandpaper. Even 1,000 grit, it's just not as smooth. And by using a hand plane, all the pores of that wood are open, so it takes oils and stains so much better. They look a lot more beautiful than if you're sanding and clogging all that stuff up. So there's a beautiful cut. Now, I have this number 5 over here set to kind of normal use. And I'll show you real quick. So the mouth opening is about a little more than a 1/16 of an inch. And the chip breaker on that is set back about, I don't know, a little proud of a 1/16 of an inch. And this is a piece of white oak, and the grain's running in the proper direction. There's nothing squirrely with this piece of wood, and it should cut this no problem. There's no tear out. It's planing, no problem. But when I use this same plane on a figured piece of wood like this, I'm anticipating that we're gonna have a bunch of tear out. And you should probably be able to hear it. I'm gonna Oh, do you hear that? That was a lot of tear out. So that plane cut beautifully, and that's not too thick of a shaving. It's a pretty thick shaving, but it's not ridiculous. And cut beautiful on that oak when I was going with the grain, but now, I don't know if you can see in the light, but it is torn out like crazy. Basically every dip, there's tear out. I want to show you, I can take this same exact plane and do some adjustments to it. Those adjustments I talked about. I'm going to move the chip breaker right to the front edge. Now this is a nice sharp blade. So I'm going to bring this chip breaker right up tight to the front edge. And I also tune this chip breaker so that it's dead flat. There's no chance that stuff's going to get clogged behind it. Try to get it in the right light. Where are you at? All right, that's pretty tight. So you might not even be able to see it. It's just a sliver of light, that cutting edge right now. And the front edge of this chip breaker is meeting that plane blade at about 60, 70, 80 degrees. I don't get too caught up with exact measurements. Now I'm going to move this chip breaker, or this frog, forward a little bit to tighten up that mouth. Let's see what that looks like. So if you're ever wondering what the difference between a bedrock style plane is and a regular Stanley, the bedrocks allow you to adjust the frogs without having to take the blade off, which is kind of really convenient. That's why they're very sought after and expensive. Mainly people collect them, not so much because they want them for their use. Okay, so I'm adjusting the plane blade now, looking down it on a light colored background, and you'll see the blade just stick out like a sliver. And I'm going to go ahead and try to get it centered. I'm adjusting the lateral adjustment so that's even all the way across. Okay. I have a tighter mouth now. Still could go tighter, but we'll try it. We'll try it like this first. I'm going to bring it into the wood and slowly start bringing the depth down. Hear that? It's hitting all those high spots and skipping the tear out. We won't know if it's not tearing out until we do a few passes and get down, because it's going to sound like it's tearing out for a while. So I have a pretty fine cut. Yeah, it's working nicely. Hey buddy, go inside. We got to finish up, okay? Go inside, watch your show. We'll be right in. Okay? Time out, everyone. All right, we got the child back inside. I haven't done anything else, so I'm going to continue on. You can hear it's starting to take care of all that. Now, curly maple will, no matter what, sound like that as it's hitting the different types of wood. But right now, and you know that you've got rid of all the tear out when there's no more open spots. So 100% clean cut. And if you could feel this right now, it's absolutely beautiful. Actually, there's still some on the far edge there. There we go. So yeah, it's just so silky smooth. So anyway, that's kind of the principles of setting up and using a hand plane. I hope I covered all the topics. I hope maybe you learned some stuff. Hand planing can be really frustrating at first, but if you practice some of these principles and understand how that works a little bit, try some of those out. Make sure your hand plane's nice and sharp and tuned up like that. Get that chip breaker tuned, get it close to the cutting edge, and you'll be able to go through basically any wood out there. So everyone, thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate any comments. Let me know down in the comment section what other videos you might be interested in seeing. And if you go over to my website, I have plans and merchandise, and I also have lists of all the tools that I use and recommend. There's a bunch of Amazon links on there, so if you purchase anything through Amazon, it greatly helps me out. I get a little bit of a kickback, and it doesn't cost anything extra. It's just a nice way to kind of help me keep doing this type of stuff right now in these trying times. So thanks so much, everyone. I appreciate it. I appreciate everything. We'll see you on the next video. Stay safe.